was Dejazmaskasa, who later became Emperor Johannes IV. And the reason that he did this was because Tewodros was hated among many of the Ethiopians towards the later part of his life, because his behavior had become very erratic after the death of his wife. And so Tewodros had committed many atrocities. So therefore, the future Johannes and others did not allow or did not go to help Tewodros when Napier marched against him. But in exchange for allowing Napier passage, Johannes received ammunition and supplies, which later enabled him to defeat others who were vying for the throne. And he also defeated the Turks, who had control of Egypt at that time. And the British, in turn, promised Ethiopia that if they aided them against Egypt, a major port city would be opened or returned to them. But instead, the British tricked the Ethiopians and gave that port to the Italians. Isn't that just like their normal behavior? So the Italians seized Massawa on February 3rd, 1885, and instituted a blockade against Ethiopia. They called their colony Eritrea, named after the Erythraean Sea, which was the old name for the Red Sea. And then the Italians used infighting among the Ethiopians to seize greater area in the highlands. So this is the area where Johannes had his capital, right near Axum. And he received many brothers and sisters on a daily basis. But when he received an Italian delegation, you see his face is covered, because that was a sign of imperial displeasure. He did not like it that the Italians were able to come into his court. And he also disliked European missionaries, because he said, why do foreign nations come here Christianizing Christians? They make trouble in my country, and they're not wanted. Are there no men who are pagans to be converted? In the history of my nation, the preachers of foreign religions have filled a bloody and disastrous page. He was right about that. But the reign of Emperor Johannes was marked by a lot of fighting, because he was constantly being attacked by foreign invaders, the Italians, the Turks, the Dervish. So he had little opportunity for technological innovations. He also did not build roads for fear of invasions. But Johannes tried to create a unified Ethiopia under his rule. But both Menelik and Tekle Hamamat both joined forces to fight against him, because they thought that they were the rightful owners of the throne. Johannes was later hit by a sniper while battling the Mahdists in Sudan, and became the last monarch to fall in battle. But he was one who tried to preserve Ethiopian independence. And you can see his statue out here at the airport at Axum. That is Emperor Johannes. But he wrote to Menelik about the Europeans in general and the Italians in particular. And he said, and this was a warning that would pan out throughout the years, he said, the Italian deception and bad faith will never cease. They're not serious people, but intriguers. They have come to seek aggrandizement, but with the aid of God, they shall depart humiliated, discontented, and with honor lost before all of the world. If we remain united, we can conquer not only the Fiacci Italians, but also other stronger nations. So that was his notice to the young Menelik. And here you have Menelik, who was the young king of Shoa, and he's shown here with his men in military dress. And as I mentioned earlier, he was born Saleh Miriam and was held prisoner during the time when he was a young boy in the home of Tewodros. But as he grew in knowledge in that palace, he also wanted to secure his throne of Shoa, so he became king or Negus of Shoa from 1865 to 1889, when he became emperor of Ethiopia. And he was crowned on Mount Entoto. And here's the site of his coronation. It was St. Mary's Church on November 3rd, 1889. He became Emperor Menelik II, Negus Negast, or King of Kings. And this is his magnificent crown that he wore for that coronation. Menelik expanded the area known as Ethiopia during that time. His wife was Her Imperial Majesty, Taitu Betel. She was called the Light of Ethiopia. And it's because of her that Addis Ababa is the capital of Ethiopia today. It was called the New Flower. And Empress Taitu did not like the colder weather up on Mountain Toto. She enjoyed the warmer weather in the area of Addis Ababa. So that's how Addis Ababa became the capital of Ethiopia. And it was Ras Makonnen Wode-Michael, who was governor of Harar. He was also the foreign minister and cousin of Emperor Menelik II, and later father of Emperor Haile Selassie. Here's his palace in Harar. Now, as the foreign minister, he negotiated a treaty with the Italians, and this was the Treaty of Vutrale. And on Article 17 of the treaty, there were two versions. One was in Amharic, which was spoken in Ethiopia, and the other one was in Italian. Well, Menelik refused to sign the version in Italian because he didn't understand Italian, and that proved to be a very wise move, because the Ethiopian copy said Ethiopia could communicate with foreign nations through the Italian Foreign Office, but the Italian copy said that Ethiopia would conduct its foreign negotiations through Italians. In other words, making Ethiopia a colony of Italy. And so Empress Taitu and Emperor Menelik were not going for that. And Empress Taitu in particular was a very strong nationalist. So she berated the Count Antonelli when he came before them and said that the Italians would not forget that treaty. And so Menelik realized that it was going to be war. And so he summoned his people together. And he said, did they want to submit to the white man who had seized and enslaved all the rest of Africa? He said, whatever be our differences, we can never permit our country, which has maintained its freedom for 70 centuries, to be ruled by an outsider. He said, you have seen what the white man has done to the rest of Africa. Do you, a proud fighting race, want to be enslaved like the other inhabitants of the continent? He said, Ethiopia has never been conquered, and she shall never be as long as she preserves her indomitable spirit. Ethiopia shall stretch out her hand only to God and to smite her enemies. In 1889, in the meantime, the Italians had brought cattle to Ethiopia that were infected with rinderpest disease. This caused a famine throughout Ethiopia. But Menelik, good emperor that he was, suspended the debts and taxes. So he became known as the loving mother figure Menelik. And because of this action of suspending all the debts and taxes, there was a lot of national unity. So when Menelik made the call, Ethiopians from all over came to fight against the Italians. And all of them pledged their allegiance. Even his main foe, Ras Mangasha, who was Johannes' son, he told Menelik, he said, I will drive the Italians out with the very bullets that they gave me to kill you. That's what we're talking about, African unity here. The Italian government at that time was composed of Francesco Crispi, who was the prime minister, and Umberto di Savoia, who was the king. Then there was General Oreste Baratieri, and he was supposed to be the military governor of Eritrea. And he stated in a speech before the Italian parliament that he would bring Emperor Menelik back to Rome in a cage. He also said that his 10,000 civilized, so-called civilized troops would crush the 20 to 30,000 savage army of the Emperor of Ethiopia. But he didn't know what the Ethiopians were about to do. Because when the archbishop realized that they were about to go to war, he dropped the imperial flag, he dipped it before the altar, and he said it was time to come and lay down their lives before God, the emperor, and their country. And the Ethiopian soldiers got ready for this battle. And provincial kings decided to lay down their jealousies and their ambitions in order to defend the last independent country in Africa. In fact, the soldiers were called the Black Lions. You see he's wearing the lion's mane on his head? That's because they were named after the Ethiopian lion, which has a very dark mane. He's smaller than other lions, but he's just as tough. And that was the Ethiopian, the Black Lion. And Menelik said, as we may all die someday, I will not be afflicted if I die. But enemies have come who would ruin our country and change our religion. These enemies have advanced, burrowing into the country like moles. And he said, but with the help of God, I will get rid of them. So says Menelik, elect of God, King of Kings. So he led his troops into battle, into an area called Adwa. The Ethiopian army totaled 110,000. Menelik had over 34,000 troops under his direct command, while Ras Makonnen had 15,000, and Empress Taitu had 5,000 of her own, while the Italian army totaled only 20,819. But they thought they were so tough that they didn't need that many soldiers. They figured they would outdo these Africans. And the battle was not an easy victory, as some historians imply. At one point, the Ethiopian advance wavered, and it began to fall back under the murderous rifle fire of the Italian soldiers. But Queen Taitu, Empress Taitu, who was accompanied by Princess Zoditu, that's Menelik's daughter, and her ladies in waiting, had taken to the battlefield. And the queen rushed at the retreating soldiers, screaming, "What are you doing? We will win! Forward, strike the enemy!" And she was able to get her soldiers to cut off the water supply. It's because of her efforts that they brought down this Italian garrison. So the Ethiopian soldiers fought valiantly. In fact, Rasalula, who had worked with Johannes, he was governor of the northern provinces. In one guerrilla attack he had near Massawa, he wiped out so many Italians that the rest of them withdrew back to the coast. And he said, the Italians can come and take Ethiopian land, but only after I become governor of Rome. This was the Battle of Adwa, and the Italians underestimated the unity of the Ethiopians. Even the Askaris, which were supposed to be Eritrean working for the Italians, they gave the Italians faulty maps and went and gave Menelik secret information of the Italians. And the Battle of Adwa in 1896 saved Ethiopia from the European colonial conquest called the Scramble for Africa. So the Ethiopians were victorious March 1st, 1896 at the Battle of Adwa. And here you see the remains of a few of the Italians that were lost on the battlefield. But Emperor Menelik became the first African to defeat a European army in the modern era. And he made Italy look incompetent. In fact, his efforts on the battlefield brought down the whole Crispi government because they had lost so many soldiers on the battlefield. And here you have Menelik and his soldiers taking the Italians hostage and then putting them on the railroad train so they can head back to Italy where they belong. And because of this Adwa victory, it was significant not only for Ethiopia, but for Africans around the world. It was a fountain of pride and a source of inspiration for millions. The Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey immortalized his tribute to Ethiopian heroism by incorporating Ethiopia in his African national anthem, which reads, "Ethiopia, thou land of our fathers, thou land where the gods love to be. As storm cloud at night, southern gathers, our armies come rushing to thee. We must in the fight be victorious when swords are thrust outward to gleam. For us will be victorious, be glorious, when led by the red, black, and green." That was Marcus Mosiah Garvey. And this statue of Emperor Menelik II is there in Addis Ababa today. It was erected by Emperor Haile Selassie in commemoration of the Battle of Adwa. But there were some who criticized Menelik at the Battle of Adwa. They felt that he should have continued on to the coast and saved the brothers and sisters in Eritrea. But Menelik's troops had been weakened by the famine. They didn't have any provisions left after the battle, so he had to end up stopping. And so many of the Ethiopians who were in the area of Eritrea, which was occupied by Italy, felt that Menelik should have liberated them. And therefore, Ethiopia also still had no access to the sea, so it became dependent on the goodwill of the neighboring colonial powers for an import of arms. But Menelik continued with modernization. He started the Post and Telegraph Office and instituted stamps in his image, as well as the Bank of Abyssinia, and their coins were minted with Menelik's image on those too. And he also drove the first auto, instituted paved roads, built hospitals, promoted the use of telephones, schools, created a standing army, the first printing press, and commissioned a rail line. And here you have Empress Taitu and Menelik in old age. Now Menelik suffered a series of strokes. And actually, Ras Makonnen was supposed to be the heir to Menelik, but he had died prior to Menelik. So it was Lijiyasu, Menelik's grandson, who next took the throne. And he wasn't very well liked by the nobility because some say that he was a womanizer, and some said that he was a Muslim or had Muslim tendencies. But they decided to get rid of Lijiyasu. And after the fall of Lijiyasu, it was Empress Zoditu, who was Menelik's daughter, who took the throne. And she represented patriotic conservatism. She was coronated in Addis Ababa in 1917. She became Queen of Kings, conquering Lion of Judah, Empress Zoditu. And Marcus Garvey had a great love for Ethiopia. And on the eve of his departure from Jamaica to the United States, he said, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king. He shall be the Redeemer. Princes will come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia will lift up her hands unto God." And many believe that that Redeemer was the young Rastafari. And he's shown here with his father, Ras Makonnen. And he was born July 23rd, 1892, according to the Western calendar. His father gave him an excellent education, so therefore he was able to assume governmental duties at a very young age. He also learned directly under Menelik because he had to stay in the palace with Menelik after his father passed on. So with the political arrangement, once Empress Zoditu came to the throne, Rastafari became regent and heir to the throne. And he was more of an active political figure. He became in charge of political affairs and interacted with foreign officials because his father had always encouraged him to travel. He gained Ethiopia's entrance into the League of Nations, which he hoped would give collective security if Ethiopia was ever attacked, that the other countries in the League of Nations would do that. And here he is as crown prince and regent of the Ethiopian Empire in 1917. He was later negus and heir to the throne. And then in 1930, he was crowned Emperor Haile Selassie I, conquering Lion of Judah, elect of God, King of Kings, and you see him here in full coronation regalia. And this crowning of a black emperor was just amazing to people all over the world. So Time magazine put him on the cover of that magazine. And they couldn't believe that here this African man had lions for pets. And he's shown here with his wife, Empress Menen. They couldn't understand how this African man could be an emperor during that time. But some of his accomplishments: he established an Ethiopian Air Force. He signed an arms agreement with Britain, France, and Italy. He introduced the first written constitution in 1931, the second anti-slavery decree, and replaced Menelit's Bank of Abyssinia with the Bank of Ethiopia. He also started a Ministry of Education, schools for girls, Ministry of Public Works, the Empress Zoditu Memorial Hospital. He had foreign advisors to come in who would help in terms of policy making, finance, and education. Started the first radio station, and also started a military college during his time. So there was a lot of modernization. He was leading Ethiopia into the modern world. But Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy in 1922. And initially, he tried to act like he wanted to be on friendly terms with Ethiopia. So they signed a treaty of friendship with Italy and Ethiopia. But Mussolini was secretly planning and plotting against Ethiopia, because the Italians were very upset that all of the other European powers had colonial possessions in Ethiopia. In Africa. But Italy really didn't have anything. You have the British in the pink, then you have the French in the purple, the Portuguese is in green, Spanish is in green. Everybody had a colony but Italy. And so they had a political movement at that time called fascism. And that was an authoritarian political movement which attempts to have state control over all areas of life. And so Mussolini also used propaganda to pass on simple little slogans like believe, obey, fight. Sound like George Bush, doesn't it? But the main thing that they wanted was revenge for Adwa, because Italy had been humiliated and they never forgot nor forgave the Battle of Adwa. As Ashra mentioned, from the time of the Caesars, they wanted to conquer Ethiopia. And Mussolini looked at himself as a modern-day Caesar. With the worldwide depressions of 1929, Italy wanted new foreign markets. And they felt that they did not have sufficient and substantial colonial possessions like the other European countries. So, in order to get things started, the Italians decided to incite a little problem on the border of Ethiopia and Somalia. And they had built a fort there at Wawa. This is where the fighting started. And Mussolini decided that after that fighting that he would invade Ethiopia using Eritrea as his main base. So without even a formal declaration of war, the Italian Royal Air Force bombed the city of Adwa. They wanted to get back on Adwa from the beginning. He sent Emilio de Bono as his general to lead them into Addis Ababa, to take over Addis Ababa. He was named the High Commissioner of Africa. But Mussolini thought that de Bono was moving too slowly, that the rains were going to come and that de Bono was too old anyway. So he got another general, a de Baglio, to lead the Italian forces in faster. And then the emperor had to proclaim war. So he did this to the sound of the drum out in front of the Grand Palace in Addis Ababa. And there you have the emperor who was reviewing his troops. But his troops, they were ready, willing, and able to fight, but they only had rifles. They didn't have anything to compete against the well-armed Italian forces. The Italians had these bombs like you see right here. And the Pope of Rome gave them a blessing to drop those bombs on Ethiopia. But the emperor had another plan. He wanted to get brothers and sisters in this part of the world to unite and aid for Ethiopia's cause. So he sent Dr. Malachiu Biyin to help form the Ethiopian World Federation in 1937. And here you have Ethiopians of the Western Hemisphere who wanted to work for the cause of Ethiopia. They helped collect funds in order to send money to Ethiopia. And so you had people like Ralph Bunche and Dr. Leo Hansberry. I actually showed you his book earlier. And they were all involved in the cause of Ethiopia. There was also the Pan-African Reconstruction Association in Harlem. And you have it where they were recruiting volunteers to go and fight in Ethiopia. So brothers and sisters from this part of the world were joining forces to help the brothers in Ethiopia. And you can read about this in a book called Bond Without Blood, A History of Ethiopian and New World Black Relations. As you see the emperor here with Adam Clayton Powell of Abyssinia Baptist Church. Hubert Julian, called the Black Eagle, was the first black aviator in Ethiopia. Then you had John Robinson. He was called the Brown Condor. He was from Tuskegee, and he became Emperor Haile Selassie's personal courier. So he earned great respect for his participation in the war effort. Also, Janet Bragg, who you see right here, she hosted Ethiopian students who were studying in the U.S. So there was a lot of involvement from brothers and sisters from the Americas. Here you have another group of pilots who helped train in Ethiopia. But Ethiopia's Air Force in 1935, you can see it was very small. It could not compare with the vast amounts of weaponry and planes that Italy was able to produce. Ethiopia had to import arms. And when the League of Nations decided to put sanctions against the two countries, Ethiopia and Italy, it was more harmful to Ethiopia because Ethiopia could not make her own munitions and make her own planes. But the brothers were willing and able to fight. And at the Battle of Meishu, this is where the Italians used mustard gas, poison gas, against the Ethiopians. And as we're told in the book Ethiopians of the Western World, that despite the preponderance of armed might, the only way that Italy won was to use poison gas against the Ethiopians. It was a black nation, so who was going to say anything? And this shows the results of some of that mustard gas. So the emperor had to depart Ethiopia in 1936 because he wanted to lay the cause of Ethiopia before the world. So he went to England, where his daughter, Sahai right here, was his personal secretary because she was fluent in both English and also French. And he went before the League of Nations, and he described the belligerence and the atrocious crimes inflicted on Ethiopia by Mussolini. And he said, "What answer shall I take back to my people? It's us today, it'll be you tomorrow. God and history shall remember your judgment." And as Winston Churchill wrote in his book, The Gathering Storm, he said that the League sanctions that they put on Italy were not real sanctions that were designed to paralyze the aggressor. They were more or less half-hearted sanctions that the aggressor would tolerate because they were really afraid of Mussolini. And so that League of Nations that was supposed to be a collaborative effort, a collective defense, proved to be a failure. So the Italians bombed the city of Gundar, where we saw the magnificent capitals. And we go there to this day, and you can see the bomb remnants there of the castles. But they were advancing into Addis Ababa. De Bono, Graziani, De Baglio, all of them were coming into Addis Ababa. Badoglio entered Addis Ababa first in May of 1936, and then he proclaimed the King Victor Emmanuel as Emperor of Ethiopia. Rodolfo Graziani was named Viceroy of Ethiopia in 1936. But the brothers and sisters, the patriotic defense, the Black Lions had a plan for Graziani, and they attempted to assassinate him, kill him. And this is after the attempt on Graziani's life. Then they started mass crimes against the Ethiopians for doing that. Ras Destadimtu, who was son-in-law of Emperor Haile Selassie, was executed because he was believed to have been one of the plotters to kill Graziani. And here you have him. He had been commander of the Southern Front, and he was executed. And you can find out more about Italy's war crimes in this book called Italy's War Crimes in Ethiopia from 1935 to 1941. And here you see how they did the people. These are relics of a massacre of Ethiopian people in February of 1937. Those Italian fascists killed them and then dumped their bones in a well. They hung innocent civilians and even cut off heads and then dismembered bodies. And this was to make the Ethiopian people afraid of the Italians. But that plan backfired on them. In fact, what happened, it encouraged more activities against the Italians. So here you have the Black Lions Resistance Movement. These were the Ethiopian patriots who continued a guerrilla warfare against Italy. And Ras Imru, Haile Selassie, was the emperor's cousin, and he was made commander and head of the Black Lion Resistance in southwestern Ethiopia. And then Shawaragad, she was an undercover patriot, and she was instrumental in storming an Italian stronghold. So brothers and sisters worked together in order to defeat the Italians. And as Ashra mentioned in his presentation, the Italians stole one of the Aksumite stelas. They also took a series of crowns and manuscripts and crosses. All of this was taken by Italy. And what did Italy bring to Ethiopia? Death, destruction, division, prostitution, and spiritual enslavement, brothers and sisters. That's what Italy brought to Ethiopia. And then when Mussolini joined forces with Hitler, then France and England decided, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. We got to do something about this. So it wasn't until he joined forces with Hitler that they finally came back and started fighting in Ethiopia. And this was the Allied invasion that you see in the lighter arrows in 1941. So Emperor Haile Selassie was able to make a triumphant return on May 5th of 1941. But even when he made that return, it automatically didn't go right back to things the way they had been, because Britain looked at Ethiopia as an enemy territory. And they decided that they needed to be in control. So Britain basically stayed in control there in Ethiopia until about 1944. And that was when they signed the Anglo-Ethiopian treaty for Ethiopia to return to its own independence. But Marcus Garvey wrote in his magazine, The Black Man, that Haile Selassie had failed to prepare his country technologically for an assault by European powers. And he thought that the emperor should never have left his people. However, Emperor Haile Selassie and his advisors felt that if he went into exile, then the Italians could never take over the government. This also saved him from being captured by the Italians. So that was a smart move by going into exile. But once he returned, Emperor Haile Selassie became instrumental in uniting many of the other African leaders. The Organization of African Unity had its headquarters there in Addis Ababa. He also became he made a number of state visits because he wanted to go to Japan, India. He met with many other heads of state. He also set aside land for Africans who wanted to come to Ethiopia to repatriate, and that land is known as Shishimene. Emperor Haile Selassie led Ethiopia into the modern era by making sure that many of the children were also educated. But there were criticisms of his regime. Some said that they didn't like the fact that he had absolute power. Some criticized the fact that he had gone into exile and awards were given to those who were in exile while the patriots suffered in Ethiopia. So the peasants began to revolt. There was also a great disparity between rich and poor, and there was a famine going on in Ethiopia. And students who studied abroad had criticisms about a lack of change and progress. So there began to be a revolt against Emperor Haile Selassie. And in 1960, while he was away from Ethiopia on a visit to Brazil, the head of the Imperial Police and the Secret Service decided to have a coup. And they instituted this coup and put his son, Asfawosen, as the emperor. But Emperor Haile Selassie was able to come back in and regain his throne. So that coup didn't work. But there were a number of different demonstrations going on in Ethiopia. And here's a student demonstration against the Haile Selassie regime. The army also began to rebel. So in 1974, September, they took the Emperor Haile Selassie and placed him in a blue Volkswagen and took him away. He was deposed. And Mengistu Haile Mariam became the ruler at that time. And his rule became a totalitarian style of government. He had massive militarization coming in from the Soviet Union. And thousands of people who were suspected as being enemies, they were tortured or killed. And this time period was called the Red Terror. So people were afraid to even mention the emperor's name during this time for fear of being killed. Also, there was a lot of opposition, once again, to Mengistu's regime as time went on. So his government had difficulties with droughts, famine, opposition movements, and in 1989, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front merged with other ethnically based opposition groups to form the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. And their forces in 1991 advanced on Addis Ababa, and Mengistu had to flee the country and take refuge in Zimbabwe. Later, Meles Zenawi was elected prime minister on August 22nd, 1995. And so this is where they are